before I start the questions, actually let me introduce the two other people we have here at the front who you also saw in the documentary. So we have Sergio Avila on my left. So Sergio for 20 years has worked in the non-profit sector in local and regional conservation efforts along the US-Mexico borderlands as a conservation scientist and a wildlife researcher, as well as being a facilitator of binational conservation action. He was also recently appointed a member of the City of Tucson's Committee on Climate, Energy and Sustainability. So great to have you here, Sergio. And then we have Jan Skipper from Phoenix Zoo on my far left. So Jan is a conservation biologist and wildlife ecologist with over 20 years of research experience in Central and South America. And his experience goes across a variety of mammalian species, including status assessment of the world's mammals. And I mentioned he's at Phoenix Zoo. He's the Field Conservation Research Director at the zoo, as well as being an adjunct faculty at Arizona State University. So welcome. Now, having introduced you both, before I get to you, I actually want to turn, first of all, to Sam. To give us a little bit more context here. And so we've talked a little bit about the broader view you get from the documentary. And one of the things that struck me was putting the policy and the politics aside, just how beautiful the area and how tranquil the area is around there. And I know one of the things you told me was, even though you've lived here for so long, this was also a surprise to you. And if you can say a bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm born and raised in Phoenix, and even going down to Tucson, I rarely did growing up other than for soccer games or something. So going down to the border, I didn't know really what the environment was like. When I told people I was camping down there, one of the spots I camped alone down there, which my parents will tell you they were not happy about that. And it's, you know, they're national parks. It's Oregon Pipe, Coronado National Forest, among others. And they're just really pretty areas. Coronado in particular is like grasslands. I had deer running across in front of me when I was driving. You know, there's border agents down there, but it's not like this military, you know, people walking around with machine guns or anything like that. But it's also a really stark contrast when you see this huge wall just cutting through the middle of it. You know, you're standing there and there's houses and farms and people on the Mexico side living their life just casually, normally. And then you're sitting over here with your car and camera, and it's just a weird, I don't know, this thing to see that it doesn't seem real.
Right, and so one of the people you're interviewing made this point that so many of us think of the border as being a bloody, dirty place. And certainly if you're listening to the rhetoric coming out of DC and within the Beltway, that's the impression you're left with. And it seems to be such a stark contrast, at least with this portion of the border that you were visiting.
Yeah, you definitely, I think there's a quote about, you know, drugs being thrown over the wall and stuff like that, and it's not like that. That's not to say that people aren't coming over the border. I mean, it's also not to say that drugs aren't coming over the border, but most of that's happening in a very secretive way, through tunnels, through submarines on the in our oceans in the Gulf. It's not, you know, just a bunch of people sitting there like throwing tons of drugs over the wall. I'm like, okay, catch it, or, you know, that's not what it's like.
Reality is a little different. Yeah. So Sergio, turning to you. So you obviously, you worked with Sam on this. She sat you down and interviewed you about this, and you've obviously seen the documentary before. What was your sense, actually, sitting down and watching it again? What are the messages here that really sort of resonate with you that come out of it?
Thank you. First, I want to congratulate Samantha for a great job on the documentary. I think she spent a lot of time not only talking to people who are knowledgeable about the issue, but going to the places, which is the part that most of the media and most of people are not doing. And that is the message. The message of a young woman who is from the state of Arizona and doesn't know the border. The message of her family being concerned about a dangerous region and this not being the case. The message of violence and fear, and how many towns and how many cars did you see south of the border when you slept there? How many people south of the border moved around? Like, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing out there.
Yes.
There's nothing. You're just outside of Sierra Vista.
Chickens.
And exactly. And so the main point is that, one, the farther you go from the border, the less people know about it. Phoenix is a really good example. And the other one is that we continue to perpetuate and repeat this story of violence. And we allow our representatives to represent us based on fear and based on threats and based on truths. And this 10-minute documentary and the experience, her own life experience that she had at the border, is way more informative than the last 10 years of rhetoric of Senator McCain and others who not only represent Arizona, but also represent states that are not border states.
So I want to come back to this in a few minutes and really look at this idea of how do we have a dialogue around evidence rather than just being assumed to be the case. But before then, Jan, let me come to you. And could you just say a little bit from your perspective about how this artificial ecological division is actually impacting the environment at the border?
Well, that's a great question. It's something that we probably think we know a lot more about than we actually do.
Right.
We've been trying for the past couple of years to gather every bit of knowledge that we have about the impacts of border walls, and then we found very quickly that there's not very much at all in the U.S.-Mexican border area, so we rely on knowledge from other border areas. But the amazing thing is that we just know almost nothing about the impacts that it's going to have, and then we extrapolate based on like the size of the animal, whether or not it can actually fit through there, but we don't really talk about the behavior and what behavior makes it.
And just to be clear, this was really highlighted in the documentary. To the environment and the ecosystems around there and the animals, this is a totally artificial division. They sort of live their lives crossing over it. So from what you were saying, there are problems if you put an artificial barrier there, so that the different species can't actually move around in the way they expect.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when it's just laid on the landscape in a straight line with no consideration for anything.
Right, right. Now, is there any evidence at all of how different types of barriers have affected that? So again, another thing that came out, and I really wasn't aware of this, there are so many different types of border and barrier there, some of them incredibly flimsy, some of them much tighter. So do we know anything about sort of how the different types of barriers affect either migration or just sort of general habits?
Oh, absolutely. So the tall 20-foot or 20-plus foot border walls are mostly around urban areas, so they aren't having as much of an impact per se on wildlife because there's already urban presence there. So one of the things that we're seeing is we are getting jaguar coming back into the United States now, and that's because there's not a closed wall, because there's still areas where there is barbed wire fence and that's it. There's a lot of electronics around monitoring those areas, so it's not just that the border's open, but there isn't the barrier there. So that's where we're still seeing bears and jaguars and pumas and bighorn sheep still being able to move back and forth across there. So a lot of what we know, we extrapolate from the fact that they still can get through, but we don't know what effect closing all those would have.
Right.
We wouldn't have any more jaguar in the United States, for example, and probably bears would not be able to return to Mexico.
And so, to both of you, actually to all three, if you look at the current plans for the wall, and we're well into prototyping different types of wall, do you have any sense of whether plans at the moment include any consideration at all for ferocity with wildlife?
No.
Right. Okay. In fact, I'm just trying to remember. Well, that's a discussion killer.
We'll have more pizza.
So presumably, and I'm just trying to think of the prototypes that I've seen. From what I can remember, we're actually looking at pretty solid structures with sort of no porosity whatsoever there.
Yeah, a lot of them, the New York Times just did an article about the different styles that they're looking at. Most of them are the pedestrian barriers, the solid, not any of the bollard or anything like that.
Right.
And they're looking at what could be aesthetically pleasing, which is like a bright blue. It's not good at all. And then a lot of them have rounded edges because it's supposed to prevent people from coming up, which a ladder, that's not going to stop giant ladders. They're also talking about going underground, like 6 feet or more, so they can stop tunnels and things like that. And obviously cost has a lot to do with that.
So, Sergey, let me actually come back to you on that, and I want to circle this round eventually to talk about how we use evidence in decision making. But from your perspective, this seems like a world away from the border you described, putting an absolutely solid, impervious wall there that goes deep underground as well as sort of very high. just talk a little bit about sort of how that seems to diverge from the reality that you see at the border.
Well, for me, the prototypes that you're seeing, I mean, they are very. It reminds me of the Berlin Wall. You know, it's very solid. It's just more. It's more of a something to be iconic or a symbol as opposed to actually being effective for the current administration. And that's, I think, what's frustrating is they're not looking into environmental issues as we've spoken about. They're not looking into research on where is the most crossing happening, where is whether it's human or drug or wildlife, what is most effective, how are people coming over the border, and I think Jan even said in this video about social issues and educating people, and we're not putting any time into that, but we're just letting drug abuse keep happening. That we're letting people. The demand is still there for that.
Let me just do a really quick straw poll, realizing that this is probably a highly selective audience. Raise your hand if you think that it makes sense to have at least some discussion around the environmental impacts of the nature and structure of the border. Anybody want to dare to answer the question, do you think we should totally ignore the environment? Nobody brave enough. No, I thank you. Somebody actually was brave enough to say so. So to me, this is really intriguing because there has been this whole rhetoric about just one purpose for the wall. And I think you're right, even though we talk about it being a barrier to humans going back and forth across the border, it is largely symbolic. But in none of that rhetoric is there anything about, even if you're going to put a wall there, you design it in such a way that you minimize the environmental impact. So, Sergio, I do want to sort of come back to you on this and get a sense from you as to whether you think that the dialogue should be around how we actually make the wall effective so it minimizes impact, or whether there are broader issues around here associated with the idea of a wall in the first place.
I think the real issue here is the discussion about the rule of law and how the US Congress has allowed an appointee, not an elected official, in the shape of the Secretary of the Homeland Security Department to waive the laws. So this is not about the environment or people dying, it's about all of those things, but the basic thing that covers all these issues is the fact that the US Congress gives themselves permission, created a law to waive laws.
Right.
And so there's a list of about 36 laws that goes in the documentary in white caption. And so if we don't have the National Environmental Policy Act, if we are not looking at the Endangered Species Act, if we're not looking at Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, if we're not looking at American Repatriation Act, if we're not looking at all the laws that already exist that should be applied in federal lands, because these are public lands. Your funds are being used for this. You are paying for this. So that's where you come in. It's not talking about the environment, it's changing the Section 102 of the Real ID Act in order to push our representatives to not tell the lies. And the main problem with the border issue is that we all want to use common sense. This is not a common sense issue. Stop using common sense to try to understand what's going on. It's not about common sense.
So does that mean we just have to abandon common sense, or do we somehow have to try and bring common sense back into the conversation?
I think it's up to, we've tried with lawyers, it's not up to lawyers, it's up to Congress. And we need to vote for Congresspeople and support Congresspeople who are not weakening the environmental laws. And for that matter, when you introduced the video, you were talking about, had to specify that this was about the US-Mexico border. In fact, Robert Bishop, a representative from Utah, is trying to weaken all environmental laws and create barriers also in the northern border. So this is a bigger problem than the US-Mexico border. It's about laws.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because that's the slippery slope argument that said if we do it in one place, it opens the door to begin to trample on these environmental laws elsewhere. How serious is that an issue? Let me jump back to you, Jan. I mean, is this something that would concern you, that if we deal with one particular situation like this, it then opens the door to begin to push aside environmental laws elsewhere in the name of national security? whatever.
I think we're seeing that in our administration on every front right now. There's no doubt that will, and it already has started, I think. But yeah, I think it's going to make it a very leaky system and very hard to keep control of anything, because almost everything that we do and try and do it right, we have some sort of environmental impact statement. If we're going to build a solar array to harvest energy, then we need to do environmental impact assessment to see what impact that has. But if you don't do it, you have no idea what impact it has until it's too late, and you've had the impact and the species are gone.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here and make it very clear that this is not my perspective. But how do you respond to the people that say, that's all well and good, but we've got a major homeland security issue here, and therefore it's more important to build barriers than it is to worry about the environment?
So we kind of said it in this, but when people are talking about having barriers, I mean, I think it was either Dinah or Roger who said, barriers don't stop people. The technology that's out there can be effective. The goal of this was never to say, Border Patrol is bad or Homeland Security is bad. They are, keeping us a free country. They're keeping us safe. We want to support. I wouldn't want to be in the tunnels doing that work that the border agents do. So we want to support them, but I think there's a way that they can do it that's more effective, like using drones, using thermal technology. Usually I think you said about pressure pads where they can sense people are crossing and stuff like that. There's ways to, in technology, and if we do put more funding, not into legal services of acquiring private land, but put more funding into research and development on this type of technology, that would be way more effective in preventing.
And can I get a sense from the Jan and Sergio on this as well? Because there are multiple arguments here. One of the arguments is that we just shouldn't have borders at all. This is a false political idea. Is your perspective closer to the idea that borders are important, but you've got to do this in the right way so you actually achieve appropriate goals rather than inappropriate goals? By that I mean getting back to what Sam said about using different types of technology to protect that border. Is this the right way of thinking about it, or are we framing the problem in completely the wrong way? It's a complex question. Sergio.
I think we're framing only a part of the conversation because we really haven't talked about what the problem is.
Right.
We're not talking about the root causes. Are we talking about immigration? Are we talking about terrorists? Are we talking about drugs? Are we putting all of these problems into a box and mixing it and saying,
right,
here, I don't see you, I'm going to create a border, you're not there anymore, right? The problem is gone. So that's how ridiculous it is. Yeah, that's how ridiculous it is.
Right.
It is about addressing the root causes of the problem, and the root causes of the problem, at least for Mexico, had to do a lot with NAFTA. It had to do with an agreement that we signed 20 or more years ago, and we thought it was going to be great for Mexico. But one of the issues is that, in theory, we have a really good idea of what technology will do. In practice, we already gave over $90 million to the Boeing company to construct towers that didn't work, and the money is gone. And so, yes, it's really cool to talk about options and how technology is going to do it, but let's also be realistic. Some of these towers are being built in Native American lands, and they're invading Native American lands. And I mean, so there's other considerations for that.
But this seems to be a really important point, asking the question, what are we trying to achieve in the first place, rather than impose a political agenda on what's happening. And that brings us back to not only working out what we're trying to do, but how we use evidence to do it. And I think this came out very clearly in the documentary, that we really don't have a good understanding from a science and evidence perspective of how to develop policies, how to develop solutions which are going to achieve something that we want to achieve, rather than somebody's agenda who doesn't even know what the lay of the land is. And Jan, let me come back to you on that, because you were quite specific there about us just not even knowing or not having the research to understand how to create barriers, even if we were going to create barriers that were effective.
Right.
How do we deal with that?
Well, I think one very effective piece of this puzzle that's missing is the communication between the Border Patrol agents on the ground and that actually live day to day there, and the people making policy in Washington. I think if we talk to the Border Patrol agents on the ground, they're not going to say we want more walls. They're not going to say we want, more technology. I mean, there's some areas that definitely would want more technology, and they don't want impermeable barriers. They need to be able to see to the other side.
Right.
And so I think there's a definite lack of communication there because we're able to work very closely with Border Patrol and agree on almost everything in terms of net need for water to pass, which if you have water passing, you can get animals to pass through as well. So I think that's not sort of the platform we need to be working with. It's really, as Sergio said, it's Washington that's really giving the misinformation and then not taking the advice of Border Patrol into consideration when they actually build the wall.
How do we fix that? 5 minutes.
There's an election coming up.
Of course, it's a big question and a silly question to try and sort of grapple in such a short time. And of course, we can say we need different people in power and authority. We need to change things with the election. But assuming that we're going to have to live with the current political environment for the next year or so, are there things that can be being done at the moment to change the dialogue, change the decisions that are being made? So, yeah.
I think documentaries like Samantha's that inform the public and that give the public better information and a personal perspective. She's not a politician, she's not a conservationist, she has no agenda other than graduating. I hope.
No, she did.
She's done. And so we need other voices. We need to diversify the amount of people who talk about it. We need to not always be the same person. And one thing to keep in mind is that evidence-based is not what's on the table right now because they don't want to read studies because they want to waive the laws. So what we need is the general public, the electorate, the voters, to put pressure on their representatives. Don't let those people in Minnesota tell you that there's terrorists coming across the Mexican border. Don't let people in Vermont tell you what's going on in this state. You need to tell them what's going on in this state.
Yeah, so that I think comes through loud and clear both from this discussion and the documentary, that people who see problems and pathways forward have got to both have a voice but actually use that voice to get the word out.
The educated voice.
Thank you. So actually say a little bit about what you mean by the educated voice.
Well, it's exactly what Sergio was saying. When you have people in Kansas, Oklahoma, DC that don't live on a border, whether it's Canada or Mexico,
or even Phoenix, Arizona.
Or even Phoenix, yeah. They are making decisions based on stuff that their policy analysts, allegedly, or whoever is telling them what to vote on, and they're not actually going to these places. When you do see like President Trump or whoever go down to the border or something, they're meeting a couple of hand-picked agents to speak with, and then they're on their way. They're not, down there walking along there, seeing what wildlife's down there. Yeah, it's a whole show for them. So you don't get a real sense of what's going on. I mean, I couldn't make a political, opinion on certain things for other people as well, because I'm in Arizona and they might have some other issues going on in a different state. So why should another group of people be making decisions on my home state or where I'm close to living and the wildlife that's around here and everything if they don't have any idea about it?
Yeah. So let's open it up to questions. Yeah.
Yeah, real quick. You guys.
And if you can say who you are as well.
Yeah, my name's Alec Warren. I'm a student at ASU. You just talked about this concept of educated voters, and the people who are going to know these issues the best are going to be those who are in that environment. How then can you explain that voters, that border states overwhelmingly voted for a candidate who said, let's build a wall, let's do all of the opposite of what you guys have suggested?
Let's take that.
So, again, I can't speak for other people. Traditionally, I'd say Arizona, Texas especially, are very conservative states. The people that are going out voting tend to be of a different generation, different mindset, so we might see that change. I mean, even just this past election year, Arizona was very much a swing state, so I think you are starting to see that change. I think a lot of it, again, is educating people not only in cities, but in the smaller towns around. With the way the electoral college works, these smaller towns have their view of the world and the cities have their view of the world. The blue and red is significantly different in every state.
So can I just ask a question here? So part of the problem to me, speaking as a Brit who really doesn't understand America, is that everything at the moment devolves down to polarized party politics. And I wonder whether that's the problem. you have to sort of put everything in the same bucket politically. Whereas in reality, it seems that the problems here are far more complex than just a black and white political question.
Yeah, so I was actually recently at a seminar where they were showing graphs on how people feel about other parties. And it used to be, obviously you didn't necessarily agree, that's why you were a Democrat or Republican or independent. Now it's like a stark, like, if you're Republican, you have this idea, I don't agree with it because you're Republican, not because I don't agree with that idea. And that is like astounding how prevalent that is in our country right now, that people are so divided just because of their party affiliation and not because what they actually think is right or know about or want to vote on. It's just because this is what my party, my team believes in, so I want to vote for that. And I think you very much see that right in the last year or so.
And it really does highlight this idea of pulling away from partisan decision making and towards informed decision making.
But I think to the point of the gentleman here that, well, I don't think the election was won at all on any border issues. I mean, whether or not they keep their campaign promises is pretty much arbitrary anyway. But there are definitely some issues around when you poll all Americans about whether, like, the president, it all correspond to their view of the border wall. So if you poll all Americans about their view of the border wall and whether it should occur, the further you get from the border, the more positive response you get to the border. So those people who live on the border, Arizona, are more opposed to the border wall than those people up in Montana, for example, or New York. So there is a relationship between those who at least know a little bit more about what the borderlands are like to favoring other alternatives other than border structure.
Questions? Yes.
I was going to respond to your point, but I want to thank you for this wonderful panel and for the work that you're doing. I'm involved with a project that I organized just around these issues, but mostly about all the misinformation about borders and about what borders are. Because borders change. I can be walking up the Grand Canyon, or I can be walking down in Nevada's, or I can be walking across the southern New Mexico border, Las Cruces and El Paso. It changes, and the people change. So the project is called the Project to Advance Community Transformation. PACT is I work easy with acronyms. PACT. We need to make a pact about exactly what we're talking about. And among our speakers in our workshops and what we're doing, we're working with ASU and community colleges, but also with community groups from Amnesty International. Anybody here from Amnesty? I'm looking around for folks. I've been a long-time member. I'm on the executive council of Amnesty International, and I am also in the local Tempe chapter. Our Western Regional Conference was just this past weekend, and we had a panel much like this discussing some of the issues about how fear that you have to be taught and encouraged, it really has to be built up. It works internationally, and that the only way that you actually work against it is by educating and by talking face to face. I've never met you before. I'm going to hold your hand, and you haven't slugged me, and I'm not going to slug you. I won't. And having those conversations that way. So what we're doing is that for our whole roster of workshops and conversations, town halls, we are working with the League of United Latin American Citizens, and there's a lot of people there that are my age and older who are much more conservative and who, they don't believe in president administration and all that, but they got a point about, they got a point about. So just to get to this point, there's that sort of issue that I would like to let you know, that there are people working and we're trying to make conversations, because if there's one thing that, and it's the humanities project, we've gotten seed funding for it, and we've applied for a much larger grant, the PACT grant. That the humanities are known about. What do the humanities do? Well, I see a lot of young people here and old people. We all use it. I'm speaking humanities now because I'm speaking language, the language of human. But the other thing that we say, in sort of as a professional humanist, we say, humanities require talking, listening, connecting. And that's what we're trying to reach out to other groups.
So that's,
and we're doing it also we've asked for permission to go to classes.
So this ties in, I think, very well with, thank you for that, with the discussion here about not only evidence but actually engaging with communities. So people actually understand the nature of the challenges but also the pathways forward. Yes. Yes, I have a couple here. Let's go over
I'm
here.
wondering if there's any, currently any binational environmental groups who are working together to address this maybe collaboratively that are already in existence that might be strengthened?
Thank you. We didn't come together, but I'm glad you planted that question. One of the things that I like to share with people is that in regards to your interest about the environment and the impacts of the border, is that don't think about the environment as ending at the border. It also rains in Mexico, there's also jaguars in Mexico, and climate change is also happening in Mexico. However, people do not deny it there. And there are groups. Well, that is reality. It is part of addressing issues. I mean, they might not be educated, they might live in the top of a mountain, but people don't deny that the weather is changing. And there's not just the posturing that happens in the United States to be red or to be blue. I mean, that's what it is. So there are binational groups like Sky Island Alliance, like the Sierra Club, like Wildlands Network, like Tucson Audubon Society, like Sonoran Joint Venture, the Desert Landscape Conservation Cooperative. There's a lot of different organizations, consortiums, cooperatives that work together to address environmental issues on both sides of the border. They need to understand that land tenure and other management are different, but Arizona is making a really good case to create and foster positive stories of conservation, which is what really is the ultimate goal, is to change the dialogue of fear and violence to positive conservation and bridges that are created binationally. So a lot of these groups are working in our region and beyond, and it's really great to take a look at them and to be able to see nature without borders and to see nature with its natural boundaries of water and land or air and land or whatever. So thank you for asking that. Yeah, there's a lot of binational efforts happening.
Another question here.
I agree with everything that's been said, but I'm going to play devil's advocate and push back a little bit.
Yeah.
Are there some areas or sections of the U.S.-Mexico border that should have a wall? Absolutely. Do I agree with a wall? You're standing on top of a mountain and you're looking at a vast desert? No, I've worked along the border as an engineer. And there's areas you got to be very, very careful. But when you take a position, especially from conservationists, and you sit across a table from people who are from Oklahoma, who are from Texas, from Minnesota, and you say, it's got to be this way, their reaction is absolutely not. We want a wall. We'll spend the 23 billion or 80 or whatever billion. We want it. So how do you, when you made a film, you were down there, how do you sit down with a group of right-wing Trump supporters and
I would say
try to find
not just right-wing Trump supporters, but there are plenty of other people around the country. You say Minnesotans, who still have this perspective.
Some might be offended.
Just,
I know,
how do you sit across the table from people who don't think like you, and try to find
Having dialogue.
a dialogue, some kind of civilized, common ground, other than I was down there and it's not like that. Because I know places down there that are like that.
Yeah.
So tell us two examples. Tell us two examples.
Yes, good.
Because it helps to be specific on this. When you present such a wide question to talk about Minnesota and Kansas.
Down near Ajo, we're building culverts underneath state roadways. Okay, I was, as part of our training, I was actually told by one of the Border Patrol superintendents.
Source of information.
So and they're located out of Tucson, is where their main office is at. And I was down there and I went to meetings and everything else. If you see a package in a culvert, call us. Do not touch it. Because if it's a sack of marijuana and you put it in the back of your pickup truck and you're delivering it to us, if we stop you, you own it. And the other thing they said was they booby trap them down there. So if you move that package, it blows up.
So there are clearly
So
different.
when I can give you several more. So people that work and live down there, you have to be aware. It's just like living in Phoenix in the big city.
So there are
certain areas.
There are
that
definitely different
There's-
types
it's
of areas.
different,
So
right.
Jan, I know he wants to respond, and then Sergio, yes.
Well, I was going to respond to something slightly different.
Oh, right. So I
Let's go ahead and finish this.
Okay.
No. My question is, based on conservation, when you sit down and people don't think like you, how do you talk? to them?
How do you build those
How do you
messages?
build that
So
bridge?
I get that opportunity quite a bit, actually, to
Okay.
talk to people who don't agree with me about border wall infrastructure. And I don't really, I mean, my opinion is based on what we know. I take a very science-based approach, a very non-political approach. That's usually why I get invited to give talks, probably because I don't take the very active approach. But if you just base it on what we know, like the benefits and the costs, there's almost no benefit compared to the costs. So, for example, if we build the current wall the way that it's centered to be, especially across Texas, when you just draw a straight line across where all the rivers end up, we lose an area the size of Rhode Island, just south of the border. Like we just push that to Mexico and say, we're not going to manage this anymore, this is going to have to be yours. That's a huge loss that we never talk about. I mean, the drug problem is not created by Mexico, they're just supplying, it's a supply and demand chain. So that can't be used as an argument, really, to, we're not going to stop drugs by just blowing the wall. They're smarter than that. Most of the drugs don't come across the wall, they come in the trucks and they come in the boots. And we know that too. So if you just look at what we know, there's almost no good argument for a wall except for fear, which I think has come up now
Which is
several
the
times.
example of
Yeah.
case sharing.
Yes.
Which is the example of fear, but I work on the border, I have camera traps on both sides of the border. You see a noticeable difference in the quality of the environment is much better in Mexico than it is in the US because of all the border roads and everything else that's there. So there's a huge problem with just the way that we understand what we think we know and what we know. I guess what I started off in the beginning, we think we know a lot more than we do. When you come back to what we know, there's really very little to justify $80 billion on a wall when we have solutions that we could do for a fraction of that, probably an order of magnitude less.
Well, has a documentary, one quick follow-up, has a documentary been made on the Mexican side, looking at it from the south side, looking north about what you just did? I mean, do you have like a student counterpart or a documentary filmmaker on that side?
That's the secret.
As far as I know, I looked up a lot to try to see what was already out there, so I could try to get an angle that hasn't been shown. I didn't find any content from Mexico, but that's not to say it doesn't exist.
But I think it's a really interesting question,
Yeah.
whether somebody could actually do that and enrich the dialogue from that perspective.
I know there's different stories that are out more on the relationship between people that are right on the border, between Nogales or wherever, like that are Sonoyta, like right there. But I don't know if it extends beyond as far as looking at the habitats environmental.
So we're almost out of time. Yeah,
So
sorry.
I was going to say there's a lot less knowledge. A lot of people in Mexico don't understand what's happening in the U.S. too. So if you took a perspective of somebody in Sonora, as you're probably aware, they don't understand why we're having this big discussion about the wall, why this is such an issue, why we're closing down NAFTA, why our president's seemingly doing a lot of things. So I don't think it would come across quite the same. Because we get out there and try to explain to people what's going on, and it's almost impossible to explain for one thing in any logical way, but I think it'd be a very different perspective.
So we're almost out of time. I want to take just one more question. I saw lots of hands. These folks are going to be around afterwards. I'm going to go with youth and go with Jess.
Has this video been circulated to any politicians in terms of being could this be the future of policy memos where you could submit videos?
I think we discussed this a little bit in some of my courses, is talking about a new way to discuss policy in, not just making policy memos, which I know we did a lot in class, but is there a different way that we can spread information? But as far as I know, there's not a very large format for it. I mean, YouTube.
So,
Send me the links.
Yeah.
so I'm actually gonna. Yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to
Is
say
this
that
just a
if
quick comment? Yes.
people are interested in this, we're having a create-a-thon and a hackathon that's working on helping biodiversity, but using sensors and that sort of thing.
Where do people find out about that?
It's Mesa Main Library. It's November 25th, 9 o'clock until 5. We're also working with social media folks and social psychology folks on how to craft the message. You can email me at travel8@asu.edu or go on Eventbrite and type in create-a-thon with hyphens.
Okay, great, thank you. And the final point, riffing off that comment, the video is out there on YouTube, so if you want to use it to start a conversation, anybody can do that. Sam, where do they find it?
I can send the link. I'm happy to do that. If you look up Wild Freedom and border or wall or something specific to this, because otherwise I think there's a band called Wild Freedom.
Actually, with your
Don't say like
or with my
Wild
name,
Freedom,
yeah,
really
if you
quick,
put my
like,
name
who
in
has that
as
person?
well, yeah, it'll come up. And yeah, it's, please share it.
But I think this is the power of social media platforms, that it's not just down to the creator, it's down to everybody that has access to that.